So again, I'm glad Glenda did all that because the last time I took organic chemistry was 1975 and I didn't get an A in that class. So I'm glad Glenda did that first part of the class. Um, so again, I used to work for the University of Maine Cooperative Extension, and now I'm a contractor for the Maine Department of Agriculture. And the Maine Department of Agriculture has really been able to put together a really good team along with Maine CDC to try and tackle the problem of PFAS on dairy farms in Maine. It's led by Megan Hennessy. She's put together a group of agricultural PFAS specialists. We have veterinarians working on this and toxicologists. And it's really been a very good team working together to try and figure out what's going on. So um, I'm going to start with, talking about the fact that this started back in 2016, 2017, when a dairy farm in Arundel, Maine, detected PFAS in their milk. And again, most of my comments are going to be related to that 8-carbon chain that Glenda referred to, the PFAS, because that's what we see in milk, and that's what we have set as our major target for trying to figure out what's going on dairy farms is PFAS. So this dairy farm detected it. I'm going to talk about why in a minute, but again, this was early detected in 2016 and 2017. And again, we're going to stay talking about PFAS because that's what we see most of the time in soil, grass, and milk in the research we've done. We see other PFAS compounds, PFAS excuse me. We other see other compounds as well, but PFAS is the one that dominates what we see. And again, thousands of different PFAS chemicals. Some of these are precursors to PFAS, meaning they're longer chain and they do break down into PFAS. So it is a challenge to try and deal with what's going on in different situations. But when we talk about this, I want to make sure everyone understands because we're going to throw out some numbers. And it's really important to understand that we measure certain products in parts per billion and certain products in parts per trillion. And so when we're talking about numbers, make sure you realize and what you're reading about that you're understanding the important convention that we're using. So for soil, meat, forage, we're talking about micrograms or parts per billion. And again, that's dry weight. Put everything in dry weight, just like we do with forages and nutrition. And then our liquids, whether it's water and milk, we're measuring those in parts per trillion. So it's important to make sure that you look at what you're reading and what the number is representing. And I'll show you that right now because this is a map of that first farm that we worked with in Arundel. The dark brown are the soil levels in parts per billion. So you can see way over on the left-hand side, you'll see 878 parts per billion, which is the high spot in that field. But you'll see the hay, which is measured in 9.6 parts per billion. And then in white, you see the milk level is 1.4 parts per billion. Well, again, that's parts per billion, which means actually when we talk about it in most terms, when we figure out adulteration levels, we would say that's 14,000 parts per trillion, which is exceedingly high. And you can see the testing well, why this was detected was that blue, which is 0.04. And again, that's parts per billion, or would represent 40 parts per trillion. And again, so EPA and the ATSDR, which is the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, has set a guidance level of 4 parts per trillion for drinking water standard. That's the guidance coming forward now. And so you can see this monitoring well, which was at 40 parts per trillion, well exceeded that. So what happened in Maine? So basically, we saw that incident in 2016, 27 at the farm in Arundel. We had a change in administration and new administration wanted a task force or organized a task force to try and investigate what's going on. Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry did some store shelf testing where they went and went store shelves, took milk, tested it, trying to figure out what's going on and making sure that the food that is being consumed by most consumers in Maine was safe. But that did lead to some detections, and we saw that 2 farms, and we're going to talk specifically, Mark is going to talk about one, and I'm going to talk about another, where we had significant contamination. Also at that time, Maine DEP produced a map that potentially showed all the sites in Maine that had licensed sites for septage as well as sludge applications. So you could zoom in on a certain farm and to see whether they had historical applications of sludge or biosolids. And that led to detection of a couple other sites in Maine that had some problems related to milk production. So Maine at this time has what's called an adulteration level of milk. We're the only state in the nation that has that. And the Maine Department of Agriculture has set that level at 210 parts per trillion. So remember that when we look at some of the farms that I'm going to talk about, that original farm had 14,000 parts per trillion. So it's important to realize that that 210 parts per trillion in milk is probably going to be lower when we move forward because, again, this is based on original guidance from EPA. And EPA has lowered their standard to 4 parts per trillion in water. So originally that was 20 parts per trillion. So again, the standard for adulteration milk has the potential of going lower. But for right now, Maine CDC and Maine DACF has set that adulteration level 210 parts per trillion, and that is at the farm, whether that's farm is selling directly to consumer or being wholesaled to a processor. So Maine has found 5 dairy farms that exceeded that 210 parts per trillion, and that the team has successfully depurated, meaning we've been able to work with that farm and get the milk levels below that 210 parts per trillion so they could again stay in business. So out of the 5, we've been able to successfully clean or depurate out 3 dairy herds which are still in operation. And some of that's based on what Glenda said, that the half-life of PFAS in dairy animals could be anywhere from 60 to 90 days. So while they're forever chemicals, they're not forever in the dairy cow. And lactation is a good way to actually clean out a cow. So one of our research projects is to look at, how do we determine whether a farm's going to be a problem or not? And also what influences the potential of PFAS to contaminate milk. So we decided to look at starting with soil and soil testing, and then looking at plant testing, what happens to the cow, and then figuring out what's the level in milk. So we're trying to figure out this exposure pathway. And again, these levels are based on what we see in Maine. And it also depends on what kind of PFAS issues you're dealing with in terms of levels in the soil, concentrations. But again, trying to come up with some idea of this, what we call a transfer factor. What does it take for soil to potentially contaminate feed, and how much feed is going to contaminate a cow and eventually the milk that she produces? So our work has looked at trying to figure out this transfer factor from soil to plant. And it's been quite a challenge to figure that out. And I'm going to go through some of the things that we found out, but just for reference, we just got a paper published this fall in the Journal of Agriculture and Environmental Chemistry, looking at what we found for transfer factors. Tom Simmons from Maine CDC was the lead author on this and worked exceedingly hard to get this paper published. And it's really the first one that looks at transfer factors in a field setting. There are a lot of potted plant studies, but this is one that looks at transfer factors in a field study. So basically our milk testing program that went out in 2020 to look at trying to figure out if store shelf milk was safe, which it was, but we wanted to find out why were we getting some detections, and we were able to trace that back to 2 farms in central Maine. One farm had a milk level of 20,000 parts per trillion, and another farm had a milk level of about 800 parts per trillion. And if you look at the farm A, the red fields are all the contaminated fields that are exceedingly high in terms of PFAS concentration, so greater than 200 parts per billion in the soil. So that farm is exceedingly high in many of its fields. So you have to understand that that farm was a situation where we probably could not try and find a way to find clean feed for those animals. And so it was a challenge to work with that farm, whereas farm B had a lot of fields that were relatively low. They also owned another farm in another town, which had clean fields all the way around. So we were able to work with that farm. Mark is going to talk a little bit about what we did at farm A. So this is a little close-up of all the farm fields around this organic dairy farm that we were working with. Again, this is an organic dairy farm that had been conventional. The previous owners had used lots of biosolids. And so we were able to do a lot of work with this farm because of a variety of reasons. And I'll get into that in a minute. But this is the different levels of PFAS and parts per billion that we found throughout that farm. So low from about 3 parts per billion, 4 parts per billion. And most of our research in Maine has shown what we consider a background level to be 1 part per billion or less. So even at 3 parts per billion, those fields had never had any biosolids applied to them, but they've had manure applied to them from cows that have been fed a lot of PFAS contaminated feed. So what this farm was is an organic dairy farm, and all those fields were pasture at the time this situation occurred. What we did find was that we found that corn tends to have a lower uptake of PFAS into the plant. So this farm, to try and stay in business, they decided to take all those pasture acreages that were highly contaminated and put them into corn silage the first year. What they did do, though, is leave us plots of land within. You can see in that upper right-hand corner, plots of land that allowed us to go and do some sampling so we could figure out the transfer factor from soil to plant within those additional acreages to those little plots in the field. So that was very helpful for us. What we did find is that transfer factors varied from field to field and were not necessarily dependent on the concentration of PFAS in the field, which was really interesting to us. So you can see the plots 4.5, 4.6, 5.1, they all had different transfer factors, the ability of the PFAS to go from soil to plant. And these are all perennial swards of grass, had various mixtures of grasses, whether it's orchard grass, timothy, tall fescue, also a lot of red clover, some alfalfa, but we couldn't make any correlation between necessarily what the plant was in there and the transfer factor or the soil type, soil conditions. So it's kind of a mystery that we did have these transfer factors. So coming up with an average transfer factor was one of our goals. We do use an average, but it's not, I don't have a lot of confidence in it because we do see such variation. And this we've done 3 years. We see the same kind of result after 3 years of transfer factor research. And these are co-located samples. So they're 1 foot by 1 foot quadrats where we take all the forage in that 1 foot by 1 foot. And we also take multiple soil samples within that 1 foot by 1 foot quadrat. We've done this for second and third cuttings as well. And what we do see is that we see higher transfer factors in perennial forage in the second and third cuts. I think the reason for that is we see a lot of higher concentration of PFAS in the leaves of these grasses versus the stem. Stem has a lower concentration. And if you look at both second and third cutting, we usually see higher leaf to stem ratios. So we would necessarily see a higher PFAS concentration in the second and third cuttings. We also did work on corn, where again, we did co-located samples. So we have up in the upper left-hand corner picture, you see a corn plant, 3 holes around it. That's our soil sample. And then we take the corn plant, try and figure out that transfer factor. What we have found is that the transfer factor into corn, especially corn silage, is much lower than it is for perennial forages. So if we remember what the transfer factors were in the grasses, they were much higher than this. Was trying to figure out what else we could provide information to the farmer using what they have for equipment as well as storage facilities for their feed, because most of this corn silage would go in a bunker silo. And so what we've thought is, well, maybe snaplage. And snaplage is the grain, the husk, the cob, and the shank of a corn plant. It's harvested with a corn chopper, just like you would corn silage. You just have a different head, a snapper head on there, and you can store it in a bunker silo. And if you look at the light yellow, you can see that the transfer factor into snaplage much less. So one of the options was for this farm to grow corn silage. The second best option, or even the better option, would have been to grow snaplage. And so that's one of the strategies we've been using with farms to try and depurate the herd, is find clean feeds and clean systems that we can use on these farms for forages. So what have we found? Forage grasses and legumes tend to have a high potential. Corn silage, much lower potential. And then corn grain obviously has a very low potential of uptake of PFAS. So the grain itself tends to be clean. The higher component of grain to forage in terms of corn silage would probably have less concentration of PFAS, and that's why the snaplage is an alternative. Again, I guess I pretty much said that. We also looked at the investigation of trying to figure out if soil contamination is an issue, and that's still one of those issues we haven't been able to rectify in terms of, especially harvesting perennial forages. We do see a potential for a fair amount of soil to become in that feed. The ash content of the forage tends to be higher. Is that a contributing factor? And we don't have good data on that at this point. So let's get back to this 100-cow dairy just for a success story. So that's that farm up in the left-hand corner. And this is a map that anyone can download or look at from state of Maine. So all the fields that are highlighted in blue have been tested, and you can click on those and find out what the PFAS level is in those fields. The Blue squares with the red square in the inside are wells that are contaminated but have filter systems on. The green dots are wells that are potentially clean. So you can see there's lots of contamination around this site in central Maine. So this dairy farm is a 150 cow organic dairy farm. They're producing about 9,000 pounds of milk a day, 65% forage ration. Their well water was slightly contaminated at 30 parts per trillion. We put a carbon filter on there, granulated activated charcoal. We don't think that's a major component of their contamination. It was mostly the forage. The initial bulk tank test that we did there was about 800 parts per trillion. And we were able to work with this farm because they could apply to what's called the Dairy Indemnity Payment Program, where they could receive payments for their discarded milk for up to 12 months. So this farm milked their cows, filled the bulk tank, and then just opened the drain and let that milk go right down the drain for 12 months. They were able to get paid for that, but it allowed us to study what was going on with those cows over time. And this is what we looked at because I took samples from this farm almost every 2 weeks for more than a year. And we see this level of depuration that we see. Again, the half-life about 60 to 80 days. Lactation is a good way to potentially clean out these cows or depurate them. We see a few spikes, and one of the things, comes up with some recommendations, and we are working with farms. So we see this initial spike around the April of 2021, and that's when the last material of heavily contaminated haylage was hit. So one of our recommendations goes to trying to figure out why did we come up with that big spike? And that big spike came because they initially put a fair amount of contaminated feed in the back corner of a bunker. We worked our way through what we thought was a clean bunker, but they had one section in the very beginning of that bunker that they put in originally of highly contaminated feed, and we got a spike in the milk. So one of our recommendations is when you're filling a silo, think about how you're layering potentially contaminated feed in to try and dilute the total ration that's being fed out. So again, some management factors that go into trying to make sure you don't have peaks or valleys in your milk contamination. Again, we saw a variety of dropping as we go through clean feed. Bound down towards the fall of 2021, we started feeding snaplage instead of corn silage, which dropped the levels even farther. But then again, in May of 2022, we see another small spike. And what happened was we had a large group of heifers that entered the milking herd. And that spike came about because those animals were not lactating and they had consumed contaminated feed. And just like Glenda said, they had stored that and recirculated that material until they started lactating. So we saw that peak there. So one of our recommendations is to make sure that if you have heifers that potentially have had contaminated feed, to withhold their milk. And we have some studies going on to look at how quickly they depurate. And so traditionally, a dairy herd manager will hold fresh cow milk out for 2 or 3 or 4 days after that cow freshens, that colostrum. We're recommending that they potentially hold that out for a week or 2 weeks to make sure that they're not going to have a peak in the PFAS concentration in their milk, especially if they're calving out a large group of heifers at any one time. So how do we start when we work with a farm? We start with soil. That's our best recommendation. Try and characterize soil levels. It is a challenge. Obviously, when we test soils, how do we test that? How many soil samples do we take per field? Do we ignore where the stacking site was for the biosolids? All those come into play, but we've done a lot of work on trying to figure out what's the best methodology for getting a true representation of the feed coming off of that contaminated field. We find higher than background levels, and again, we think of background levels as less than 1 part per billion in the soil. And you're feeding a perennial forage, and if that's their only feed, and one of the farms that we worked with was a total grass-based farm, meaning no grain, and all they fed was perennial forages, then we have a real challenge there. So we had to figure out exactly how to mix and match their feed to make sure that they're not going to exceed that contamination level or that adulteration level that Maine set at 210 parts per trillion. And again, if soils are highly contaminated, think about how you rotate your crops. Looking at corn silage or corn snaplage is a potential way to put the best use of that material. Bunker silos are great because you can mix and match things in terms of trying to layer things. When you're doing round bale silage, it gets to be a challenge. So understanding and making sure you mark where certain fields are that you've harvested feed from that are high in PFAS, it becomes a management factor to try and figure out what's the best way to make sure that you're not going to have big spikes in PFAS concentration in your milk. So every farm is going to be different. And so one of the things that's been really successful in Maine is we have a team of people that will go to a farm and work with that farm to figure out what's the best solution in terms of trying to prioritize their feeding system, where are the problem spots, what to avoid, and what to change. And we have a really good program both to assist these farms, both financially as well as emotionally, in terms of trying to figure out how to deal with both the loss of potential income as well as the loss of a potential livelihood. Um, and again, we've been able to successfully depurate 3 of the 5 herds that we worked with.